Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the William Bonney podcast. Today I'm recording this at work. I've been away with work for the last couple of weeks and have just found it really difficult to get in and do a podcast in my spare time. So I brought all the kit into work with me. So apologies if you hear any background noise. I just thought if I don't get this done now, I'm not going to get the chance to do it again a bit later on. So thanks for sticking with me. Today I wanted to do a podcast about the infamous Holloway prison, one of the UK's largest female prisons, one of Europe's largest female prisons at one time. It was opened in 1852, and at that point it was a mixed sex prison. It only changed over to being a female-only prison some 50 years later, in 1902. Built by the Victorians. Again, it was one of those kind of classic Victorian-looking prisons with a lot of wings coming away from a central spur. And it was designed so that a couple of members of staff could basically... All of these Victorian prisons were designed so that a couple of members of staff could be stood in the middle and look down each wing from the middle office and kind of see what was going on. A lot of it was kind of punishment-based. So the Victorians didn't send people to prison so that you could rehabilitate or that you could, learn to read and write or kind of think about what you'd done, that sort of thing. It was more very much down the punishment side of things. So a lot of people would be either in workshops or they would be just doing menial tasks, such as like standing on a treadmill for hours and hours and hours every day, breaking rocks like they used to do in Portland. Or sometimes they would be untying the rope, untangling it and getting the different aspects of rope back out again so they could be reused. It was a lot of kind of menial tasks that didn't really go anywhere, didn't really improve anybody's life, but you were just making sure that you got punished, really. Holloway held the highest number of female executions at the time. So back when Holloway was open, and for a long time when Holloway was open, they still had the death penalty, and you would be hung in the prison if you was a female for your crimes. Now, the whole point of opening up Holloway was because they needed a female-only space. And even today, women only take up something less than 5% of the the amount of prisoners. We've got 90,000 prisoners in the UK at the moment, and only around 4,000 of them are women. So a lot of crime is committed by men, and a lot of the crime that's committed by women is sometimes for men, if you know what I mean. So they might be drug addicts, they might be prostitutes, it could be committing crimes for men, if you know what I mean. 82% of women that are in prison at the moment are for non-violent offences. All right, so that stat would just not hold up amongst UK men. I don't know what the stat is. I'll look it up at some point, but I'm 100% sure that it will not be 82% are in for non-violent crimes. So a lot of women are in there for kind of, again, more shoplifting, more drug offences. You do get the occasional ones that get sick of their husband and stab them to death, sick of their partners, that sort of thing, sick of violent men that are in their lives and they end up killing them. But the majority of women that are in prison at the moment are for non-violent offences. All right. It is a tricky one because even back in the days when it was open, so the sort of the late 1800s, early 1900s, in the Victorian era, infanticide, so killing a child, was 65% of all of the killings. So 65% of all deaths that happened during the Victorian era were infanticide. So killing their own children and killing other children. You got to remember, time was rough back then. In the Victorian era, you had, if you didn't have a job of your own, you had to go to a workhouse, a local hard factory in your area that would provide you again with a crappy job. And a lot of women turned to prostitution. The cost of living back then was pretty bad. I'd imagine you didn't have a cost of living crisis. That's what we got OnlyFans for these days. A lot of women are turning to prostitution again when it turns tough these days. Lots of women turn to prostitution back in the Victorian era as well, and they're the ones that would end up in prison. And that was part of the reason why that in 1902 they decided to split the prison from both men and women, because they were worried that at Holloway, a lot of these women were going in there and they were still making money being prostitutes from sleeping with the men that were in prison. So part of the reason is they didn't want them to carry on what they were doing. So that's when they started splitting men and women's prisons up. Now, I always thought that they would do it again one day. I always kind of, one of those kind of hopes that you would have a mixed wing on a prison. And you could do it with like enhanced men and enhanced women. So once you've been in prison for a while, you get your DCAT, you're enhanced, you go off to a mixed wing on a prison. So that it would just be, it would just lots of people having sex quite a lot. But yeah, it would be. I always thought that would be a good incentive to behave. If not only do you get a telly and a PlayStation, but you might get some little shoplifter from Southampton in your cell as well. So it was difficult. But so one of the things I wanted to talk about as well, not only about sort of Holloway prison, but women's prisons in general. I used to write to women when I was in jail, and sometimes girls on the outside, they don't always kind of understand prison life. So what you would do is you would write to another girl in another prison. And there's a few prisons around the country. And generally what you have to do is you have to find someone, one of your pals who's already writing to one of these girls in prison. And you basically say to her, look, have you got any friends who wants to write to me? I know it sounds a bit sad, but you say, look, have you got any friends who want to write to someone? And they'll send you back a couple of names and prison numbers, and you just send over a couple of letters. And you go, all right, Alison, it's Bonnie. Your friend Kate told me about you, and I just thought I might pass the time by saying hello. And you end up having these kind of like pen pals in women's prisons all across the country. And obviously it's we're not sitting there just talking about the weather and stuff. You'll talk about your crime and this and that, and then you end up just sending each other. It was like sexting, but before mobiles. So you ended up just sending dirty letters to each other, and it's very entertaining. So once every couple of weeks, you'll write to each other and just live out whatever kind of depraved fantasies you've got on pen and paper, knowing full well that the staff who read this have got to. The staff who read all of the letters going out of prison have to sit there and read your misspelt, 2, 3, 4 years of being away from women and your misspelt fantasies written down. We'd quite often write to women in other prison, and sometimes it would be that you didn't know any women, or you didn't have a friend who knew any women in that prison. And what people would do is you would write a letter to, I don't know, when Holloway was up and running, you'd write a letter to, I don't know, A. Smith or, C. Brown, something like that, something a very common surname. And you just say, look, hey, it's Bonnie. A friend of mine gave me a number, blah, blah, blah. And it's just fishing, like you're not speaking to anyone in particular. You're just hoping that the prison system has a C. Brown, and they basically just go and take that letter and throw it under their door. And you hope that she's bored enough that she writes back to you. And in a lot of time they will, because again, they're sat there doing years and months, bored looking at a wall, and writing to a bloke in Dartmoor who's sending you letters and stuff is quite exciting as well. So you'd end up getting all these letters from weird groupies and weird shoplifters from other prisons. But it was interesting because again, it's very different being in a men's prison as it is from being in a women's prison. So, like I say, women, 82% aren't violent. So a lot of the crimes they're in for are to do with sort of shoplifting, fraud, other non-violent things like this. And the dynamic of that makes it a lot more different as well. So because there isn't so much violence on the wing, women's prisons are, as you'd imagine, a bit more emotional. And a lot of women who are in prison suffer with mental health. So they end up talking a lot more. So when you see some of the videos from women's prisons, they'll have the flaps down and the flaps open in their cell door, and they'll talk to each other, from sort of cell to cell, during the night. And the staff allow it because it's, women are more social creatures and they need that interaction. Whereas men, flaps always shut, lights off, curtains up. You don't really want to talk to anyone. You get a few idiots talking out the window, but most of the time it's just people trying to avoid each other in the men's prison, whereas women, they want to hang out a bit more. I've always said to my wife that if she ever ended up in a women's jail, I said, she'll probably be fine. She'll probably just break down and cry on the first day. And then one of the other mother hens will take her under her arm, and, after a little while, she'll toughen up and she'll be fine. She'll have a little group of mates who are in the same boat as her, and they can sit there slagging men off, on exercise. And just get on with their days that way. But yeah, it's a lot more emotional. We get a lot more self-harm. A lot of women self-harm in prison. And you still get the same people, even throughout history. So when you look at when Holloway was first set up, you hear the reports from some of the women saying that they felt that being in jail was better than being outside, because outside meant they would be in a workhouse, 12 hours a day. They'd be sleeping in a rubbish house with like 14 other people sleeping in it. Food was, scarce. There was no access to a doctor or anything. Whereas when you're in prison, you've got your own room, you've got your own cell. You do have access to a doctor if and when you need it. And the jobs that they were doing, even though meaningless, was probably far better than working in a workhouse and being mistreated there. You might as well be mistreated in jail as in being mistreated in a workhouse. And you'll find that today, that statement in itself, that prison is better than being on the outside, just because there's structure, is really telling. And you'll find that so many times throughout history today. I even found that. So for me, being in prison, not having to make any decisions, not being in control of my life, was absolutely fine. I didn't bother with that at all. I was absolutely fine. Because you become institutionalized and you need the structure of prison around you. Because outside, the world is chaotic and there is no path or discipline. If you're outside and you're sat in your bedsit, there's no one telling you to get up and go to work. It's your choice. You do or you don't, but you struggle and your life gets harder if you don't. Whereas in prison, someone comes, they open up your door, they tell you to go to work. They've already given you your breakfast. They gave you a nice warm bed to go and sleep in. All you got to do is just go to work. Whereas, on the outside, you've had 1,000 other decisions to make before that. And it is very different. And you'll see people today, even today, there'll be someone who's in prison thinking that they're far better off in prison than they are out in their local community. Baby killing, like I say, infanticide was the big one. And you would see lots of people. Now, we've just seen today Lucy Letby, Britain's most modern day prolific baby killer, and she killed 7 babies. Possibly nearly killed 6. She got found not guilty of at least one of them. But back in the Victorian times, there was a lady called Amelia Dyer. She was known as the Angel Maker, and she's thought over a 20-year period to kill over 400 babies. Again, because it was just in a kind of time when there was no contraception, so there was a lot of unplanned, unwanted pregnancies. I imagine rape was through the roof. There was lots of sexual assault and things back then because there's no Me Too. No one cares. If a working class girl gets boned by the boss of the factory that she's working, has she got any comeback or any kind of retribution for that guy at all? So there was a lot more unwanted babies. So what they would do is they would pay people to take these babies when they were born, under the promise that they were going to be sort of, sent to better families and things like this. But these people were out there still just killing babies, just basically taking the payment for them and murdering them. It even had a term called baby farming. And there was a gang called the Finchley Baby Farmers. And these girls would pay them between 25 and 30 pounds. Now that's a huge amount we're talking about. So if you were to look at that amount these days, so that would work out, £20 would work out to be around £460 in the UK today. So these people were paying around what we would say like £400 or £500 for these babies to be taken away and possibly adopted out into the real world. So again, rich families, better families would be able to take these babies on, and these young mums would be paying, £25, £30 to take them away. But what they were doing is, again, this couple were just taking the people's money and poisoning the babies, just killing them off and getting rid of the bodies. Again, these people, the two people that got caught, the Finchley baby farmers, they were given the country's first double hanging, the first and only double hanging, back in the 1800s for this crime. It's despicable, isn't it? But again, supply and demand. When we've got too many babies knocking around and you've got poor people who are willing to do anything, these things happen. So it was a rough old jail. Now, part of the I know kind of I said that part of the punishment was punishment. Part of the day they had to spend it in silence because you weren't allowed to kind of make noise. So talking amongst yourselves and talking to other people was frowned upon. So it was against the rules. You could be punished for it. So you'd have to spend a lot of time in your cell, quietly, basically. And when you were out and about on the landings or in the workshop, you were told to be silent and quiet as well. Very different from the kind of hustle and bustle and noise of today's prisons. Because it was a London jail, you had to deal with a different class system as well, because Victorians were very, very tied into the class system. So it was interesting the way that different classes were treated in prison. So when the upper classes, when the more rich people came into prison, they would have been put on what would be now the enhanced regime straight away. So they'd go in and they'd have access to books and learning materials. You could write to the people on the outside. You'd get a few more visits than everyone else. So essentially, the upper class people were coming in on enhanced regime already. Your middle classes, there would be a lot less middle class people going to prison, but you would still get some of them. They would go in at your kind of normal regime, so they'd get a handful of visits, they'd get a couple of books to read, but life wouldn't be as good as the upper classes, but it would just be as normal in prison really. And then you had your working class girls. Now these girls made up the majority of the people in prison. And these would be the kind of lower end pickpockets, prostitutes, little fraudsters, things like this. People who got caught up in the females who got caught up in gangs and things like this. And they would be the lower classes in prison. They would get nothing. So these people would get mistreated the most. They'd be the one doing the hardest, dirtiest slogging. A lot of the time as well in Holloway, there wasn't any male guards. So it was an all-female staff up until quite recently. I'm thinking like the 70s, 1970s. This kind of time. But before that, it was all a female staff as well, so that you didn't have the kind of sexual assaults and things. Because you'd imagine that a male prison would be rife with that. Sorry, a female prison with male members of staff would be rife with that. I can't think of any organisation where if you had a load of female prisoners and then all male staff, where there just would not be stuff going on, shenanigans going on between the male members of staff and all the females. Not only because 90% of abusers are men, but also women are crafty and they will use often everything at their disposal to get themselves better. Again, going back to OnlyFans, a lot of women will use what they have to make their lives better. And they wouldn't be averse to sleeping with members of staff to get on enhanced or whatever else they need to. It was interesting that the class system had such a impact on the running of the prison as well, and it kind of it really did matter not only behaviour in prison, but where you came from when you came into the prison, basically on how well you were going to be treated in that jail. Now in 2015. The Justice Secretary at the time, Robert Gove, decided that the prison was not fit for purpose anymore. It was taking too much to keep it up and running, and it was going to be sold off. Now, obviously, anywhere holding prime real estate in London is going to be, you have to look at what its value is in homes. And the 164-year-old Holloway prison was decided by the Conservative government that it should have 1,000 homes basically built on the site. 14 buildings up to 14 stories high are expected to be constructed on the site of the former women's prison. I'm just reading from the press here. So the institution, which was one of the largest female prisons in Europe, housed suffragettes during the time when they were forced fed while taking part in hunger strikes. So that was an interesting one. So women in prison, obviously political prisoners, they went in as the kind of working class, so they would have had it quite tough. One of the difficult things that, they obviously still wanted to protest while they were in prison, so they went on hunger strikes. And as with all hunger strikes, they're not allowed to go ahead. So if you refuse food, at some point, what they will do is they will come along and force feed you. Because they don't want martyrs, basically. The prison doesn't want to see people dying left, right, and centre. So what they'll do is they'll come along. Nowadays, they come along and they'll sort of put a bit of wood in your mouth to hold your mouth open, and they'll force a tube down your throat, and kind of you'll end up being force-fed some sort of liquid diet, I imagine. Lots of people these days go on kind of hunger strikes and things. I don't see the benefit of it. No one ever looks at it and goes, "Oh my God, he's on hunger strike. We've got to fall to his demands." Everyone just kind of gets on with it, and you just end up being force-fed. The jail first opened in 1952, like we said, before becoming the UK's first female-only prison in 1902, going on to house infamous inmates, including the Moors murderer, Myra Hindley, and Rose West. It also hosted a third of all female executions in the UK in the 20th century. It is where Ruth Ellis was hanged in 1955 after being sentenced to death for shooting her lover outside a pub. The prison was completely rebuilt in 1971 and 1985 on the same site to just modernise its facilities and house around 500 women. It's been sold off to a developer called Peabody's. They will flatten the area once again, but plans to keep a nod to its past with a women's building where troubled young women can access support. See, again, I don't know. It's like anything. So football stadiums, prisons, they're all gonna, their value will far outweigh their need at some point, and they're all going to get turned over to housing estates eventually, because they're all big chunks of land that are owned by the government. So why would they not make a quick buck, sell it off? Everyone is a winner, isn't it? They said that women could now be held on remand at the more modern HMP Bronzefield in Surrey. That doesn't help if you live in London and your family now have to travel. On average, women's prisons are 60 miles away from where they live. I've been in prison, and there aren't any prisons in Cornwall. So every time I've done that, I've had to travel. 60 miles doesn't seem that far, really. Every time I've been to jail, it's always been more than that. But then that is a unique characteristic of living in Cornwall. We don't have any prisons in Cornwall. They nearly did build one on the site of an old supermarket down in Camborne, near where I live. And that was going to be turned into a remand centre for people down here. And I was over the moon. Can you imagine how sad that is when you are excited that they are going to open up a prison near you, so that you don't have to travel as far to get your visits and drugs thrown over the wall, essentially. Exeter was always about 100 miles away from me, and Dartmoor was always about 70 odd miles away from me, just over an hour travelling. So having a prison on average 60 miles away from women isn't that too dissimilar to what we go through in Cornwall, basically. Holloway is a unique prison, has a very interesting history. Female prisons in general are very different from men's prisons, and like I say, it's a lot more emotional than it is physical in a woman's prison. And eventually it was shut down. The land was worth more than the prison, so they've shut it down, and they've moved towards more modern prisons and more modern facilities. In the same way that a lot of women listen to this podcast, it's mostly men, but I do find it way more interesting that I love women criminals. Again, for me, it's just I don't understand them. We will do a special on Lucy Letby this week. Because of obviously everything that's gone on in the news. I'm just going to let that unpack and unfold a little bit. She refused to go up for sentencing today. She's been in 4 different prisons, old Lucy Letby. A bit of a sick and twisted individual. It came back as guilty in the end, which we thought she might. And she's been dished out a whole life sentence. Okay, so we will unpack that, and we will look at that a little more in future. But at the moment, thanks again for listening. There wasn't a massive amount online, but it has, with Holloway being a closed prison, it's a bit more difficult. But it's one of the country's more interesting ones. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for taking the time to join me again. I love each and every one of you, and we will do more again, with William Bonney Weekly, we will have a more. Sorry, I'm at work at the moment. I literally had someone come in just now, a customer come in. So, we'll have more more content, more stuff going on. My head's bad at the minute, but we'll do more. Thank you very much for listening. Cheers now. Bye bye.